see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Let me just introduce you. You're Erika Rosenberg, and you've been working with emotions, and you're an educator and a health psychologist, and you're also a trainer with the Compassionate Cultivation Training (CCT) program through the Center for the Center for Compassionate Altruism Research and Education at Stanford.
Right.
And you just came from a retreat or something? Or?
No. I was actually in March, just finished up one of the 8-week training classes, actually 9-week classes that we offer, the Compassion Cultivation Training Program that we do through CCARE. That's the acronym for the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. There, from the education branch of that organization is a secularized compassion training program that was originally developed by Tubtem Jimpa. Jimpa is I'm sure you know of Jimpa, but just for anybody who might be listening to this, Jimpa is a Buddhist scholar, former monk years ago, and probably best known as really the primary translator for the Dalai Lama when he's in the United States and Europe and other English-speaking countries and French-speaking. And so Jimpa was a visiting scholar at Stanford and was really charged with largely stemming from a request of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to come up with a program for bringing compassion to the masses, because this is a world that needs more of it. And I was privileged to be asked in early on to help with the development of the training manual, along with my teachers, Margaret Cullen and Kelly McGonigal, and we worked on developing a training program that's rooted in Tibetan Buddhism, but nothing about it is explicitly Buddhist. It should be approachable to people from any number of traditions or those who don't affiliate with any tradition at all necessarily. And it makes use of both meditation practices, dyadic exercises that originally came from nonverbal communication, Marshall Rosenberg's system, and some other experiential practices. So it's really kind of a marrying of Eastern and Western techniques, still very firmly grounded in meditation. And so we teach this class. It's a 9-week class. And I just finished up a class in Berkeley a couple months ago. And I offered a monthly, it turns out we're doing it every 3 weeks, drop-in for people who've finished the training, because as a place for practicing, it's sort of like a little meditation session. We do some practice, but we also talk about our lives, obstacles that come up, whatever is necessary. One of the things that I've discovered and I find is common in any other person I know who teaches this kind of stuff, meditation, compassion, loving kindness in groups, is that the group itself is really important to the training. And when the group is over, if it's a set length class and then it ends, that one of the difficulties people have afterwards is finding something to replace that community, that group setting. So I'm trying to support that a little bit. So that's a long answer to where I just was. So I was at the drop-in session.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, because actually the question I'm kind of exploring in these dialogues is how do we build a culture of empathy and compassion? And that's, it seems like that workshop you're doing is really geared to that. You're bringing together the mindfulness traditions, you're bringing together scientific traditions, and then it sounds like the nonviolent communication or compassionate communication traditions together into a full curriculum.
Right. And we also have this element of, that I think is really important, of what we call daily life practices or informal practices. So there's meditation work that you do on the cushion. And then there's what happens off the cushion. And of course, the cushion is practice time where you learn how to hone or develop certain qualities, train the mind, open the heart, using sort of what we might call tried and true ancient techniques for doing that. But the whole point is not necessarily the experience that you have on the cushion. The point is, what do you do with it off the cushion? And that's where you really test the mettle of the training, if you will. And so not only are people encouraged to like bring it to every moment of interaction, because that's ultimately the goal, but we give them little devices, little suggestions for informal practice, like throughout your day, breathing out compassion. Or one thing that I like to use a lot, and this doesn't sound like it's compassion per se, but it's connected, is 3 times a day, notice beauty. Just take a moment and do that. I mean, that you could call that a mindfulness practice, an attention practice. It's whatever the case is. When you notice what all this, the sensory delights around you, it's this little infusion of positive affect that can buoy. I'm trying to use buoy, buoy you, lighten you, support you throughout the day.
Talking about buoying, I was just looking at your Facebook page, and there you have you're buoyed by some inner tubes and on the water. Does that somehow fit in with this metaphor?
Well, yeah. Actually, I love that photograph because that's a picture with my younger son, Evan. It was actually taken a couple years ago, but I think I posted that as my profile, as that picture on my timeline, because it kind of conveyed this lightness and ease, And we were in a natural water pool in Charlottesville, Virginia, visiting some friends out there, and it's such an easygoing, kind of floaty quality when we talk about being buoyed. And I think any of the practices that we do that open the heart, loving kindness, compassion, that start to dissolve this really artificial barrier that we hold around ourselves and around our heart, and kind of penetrating that and expanding our sense of self to be inclusive of our relations with others, that really has this transformative effect on your lived experience throughout the day. It is a lightening thing, even though it might feel challenging to be able to be present and meet whatever condition others are in. Ultimately, the more we foster that kind of connection, and also work with this compassion and loving kindness for ourselves, which is vitally important to the whole process, it ultimately makes everything lighter.
So it's really about taking a little time during the day to stop, and then maybe we're kind of focused on what we're doing, is to kind of open to kind of the wider awareness, wider view, perspective,
wider view. Right. And it's wider view, but when you bring compassion and heart practices into this, it's more not just view, but an expansiveness of being. That I think of the progression that we do with compassion training is an ever widening circle of inclusiveness, from around yourself, starting we put this around ourselves, around those who are close to us, our loved ones, dear friends, but how can you make that bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger? And I don't think your camera's capturing I'm going out. My camera's not capturing my arms at this view. Anyway.
So you're opening your awareness. It's not just taking in, it's also kind of sending out your I guess a feeling of warmth and acceptance.
Well, it's ultimately it's absolutely a dynamic going both directions, and it's really can think of it as an engagement. So it's not just being present with the moment, it's being engaged with it and what arises, and keeping the happiness, the well-being, the ease of yourself and others in mind as you do, so the cultivation of compassion is for work on compassion and loving kindness, which really work hand in hand, to me have been among the most transformative practices in terms of my own emotional well-being, because the more you've trained in letting go of suffering and its causes, not wanting to suffer, and wanting to be happy. And if you repeatedly work with that, and plus you have this, skill of awareness and mindfulness and supporting that, then you can see as you go into any interaction or any situation how we sometimes create little cycles of misery for ourselves around stupid stuff, like someone cutting you off in traffic or flipping you off, or a clerk, somebody treating you rudely at the store, the little tiny sources of misery, or maybe a conflict with a coworker or a partner at home. And we perseverate on that. We have the interaction in and of itself. And then there's all the kind of carryover into our day after that. Oh, I wish I'd said that. If only I'd written that or told him that, or blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, you've now spent maybe an hour instead of the 15 minutes of the interaction, perpetuating the misery, if you will. And one of the things that really helps you let go of that is remembering, oh yeah, I want to be happy, or I don't want to suffer. Really bringing that into the moment. And if you've been practicing that over and over on the cushion, it makes it so much easier just to make that choice, that we're not totally the victims of our experience, that we have complete freedom in how we respond to whatever comes up, even when what comes up is something horrible, like major life changes, not just the little interactions that I'm talking about. So yeah, there's so much freedom there.
So it's kind of like you're bringing that energy that I'm not sure what that energy is, that kind of that goodwill. You're kind of bringing the awareness of that into your feeling of stress or conflict.
Right. It's goodwill, but also the memory, the reminder that you don't want to be miserable, and that you actually have a choice there on whether to do that, and that you don't want others to be as well. And one of the mistakes people make when they're first approaching this is to think that when you practice, softening the heart, opening up in this way, that you ultimately become spineless and vulnerable and people can walk all over you because you're not, fierce anymore. But it's actually the exact opposite. Because when you are sort of liberated from the prison of certain negative emotions, let's say you're really, really angry about something, one of the things that we know that negative emotions do to our consciousness, and there's a lot of published research on this, is they narrow our focus. And the decisions that you make when you're really angry are serving the anger, such that if you're in a situation where you have to problem solve and find an effective way of engagement, or, moving ahead in an interaction or a problem, when you're operating under the influence of anger, your decision processes might not be the best. If you can break out of that, open up, and compassion and loving kindness are ways to soften that. You can use your awareness to see that you're getting sucked into it. My screensaver just went on. No. I lost you. No. Anyway, to see that you're in the caught in it, and open it up and expand it, when you're actually outside the confines of that, your options for action become more clear. We know that positive emotions, for example, facilitate creative problem solving, such that you're actually better able to be kind of composed and see plans of action than if you were, operating in the heat of anger. That doesn't mean you lose the information that you get from the anger experience. The anger will come and go. Oh, well, I felt frustrated or thwarted, or someone did something harmful to me, and it's important to make use of that. But now, that can pass, and how can I move and engage in a way that's more effective? So in a way, the cultivation of compassion makes you stronger, makes you more willing to be present with the difficult stuff.
Well, the kind of the basic dynamic seems to be this aspect of when we're afraid, when we're angry, our awareness kind of focuses to a point, which I guess nature kind of developed that process. Oops.
Yeah, I'm just going to hang that up. Okay. Sorry.
That nature kind of, we have that for a reason, but that it kind of narrows our creativity perhaps, and then by kind of what we're wanting to do with this compassion training is kind of widen our awareness so that we can take in more creativity, more stimulus, and be able to work with that for creative problem solving.
Well, you can be broader in your thinking, and that I mean, many positive emotions will do that to your thinking. It will broaden it versus narrowing it. And Barbara Fredrickson, a social psychologist, has done some really interesting research on how that's true. But the compassion in particular not only serves that function of, expanding conscious awareness, but that is all imbued with a sense of connection to the other person. It's not just, oh, I'm feeling good now. It's not just the positivity. It's also this sense of concern for your well-being and the other person's well-being. And the more we can act in a way that's connected with the condition of another and realize how much that fundamentally affects us and the world in which we live, the better off we will all be. I mean, so there's all kinds of initiatives now. I'm sure you're familiar with the Charter on Compassion that Karen Armstrong. Yeah. So that we need this more than ever. It's ironic. Our world is increasingly connected by all these fabulous electronic means. But it seems like we're individually, interpersonally, there's a lot of isolation.
Well, I was just noticing something. I have your Facebook page up, and you have this picture of you too, which is kind of like your your Facebook page photo of you and
profile,
yeah. And you're all kind of green and blue and kind of washed out, and we have a little bit of that effect now, a washout effect on you, so it fits perfect with that. I was just wondering, what was that picture about too, that green and blue? No. What's that about?
It was just, I don't think there's anything deep in there. It was just trying to do something, playing with the effects of photo booth and trying to make it look a little bit more interesting. Although I do like the kind of tie-dye impressionistic quality it makes, but I don't think that had any, not consciously at least, any deep significance. Although I gravitate toward those colors more than the warm colors.
Okay.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, they kind of fit with the colors behind you in the in that picture there, the blue and the green. So
yeah, it's a beautiful painting.
So, you've mentioned a lot about compassion, and I did hear a talk, an interview you did, where the first question I think that the person asked was, well, what's your definition of compassion? How does that relate to empathy? And I've really focused on the aspect of empathy. And I know even within there's a little bit of sometimes even a little bit of contention I find within the empathy and compassion community, like how that really relates. Some people are saying, oh, there's this thing, compassion fatigue. No, it's really empathy fatigue.
Yeah.
And then I just heard a talk by Sharon Salzberg, and it was like all this stuff, there's all these negative aspects of empathy. And it was like all things that if you've done nonviolent communication, for example, they're all been laid out in terms of these are things that are not empathy. So there seems to be, and even I talked to Paul Ekman, who I know is, you'd worked with, and I think
he was my mentor.
Was your mentor, and you'd learned all about facial expressions and that with him. And he said, he went into studying empathy. He said it's a morass, all the different definitions and so anyway, I was thinking if we could just revisit it a little bit. Kind of like, how are you kind of seeing the two relate, and how are they different? And I have a definition too that I'd like to bring in too at some point.
Well, I can tell you how I define it, and it's not unique to me, but I think given that there are so many confusions or debates, like anything psychological, there's all kinds of debates within the field of psychology, and then just among everybody else, because their experiences that we all have, so we all have opinions about it. But just from where I'm coming from, that empathy, there are a couple different ways that you can look at what that is. There's definitely this emotional sharing component. And I'm sure Ekman mentioned this idea of resonance. And a lot of people see resonance as almost a precursor, a necessary step for compassion development. And this is sort of a slight preliminary to empathy too, that you can share the feeling. There's that kind of empathic connection you can have with somebody. You can physiologically and experientially feel what they're feeling. And there are mechanisms by which that might occur, like emotional mimicry is one of those, so that we unconsciously copy the facial expressions of people we're interacting with. And that by making those faces, one of the things that happens is we share their feelings. We can also share their feelings by understanding their feelings. And this sort of gets connected to the cognitive aspect of empathy. And I'm sure you're familiar with all this work and definition, but from where I'm coming from, both of these are important. So the key with the cognitive aspect is the perspective taking, that you can understand what it's like to be in that situation that person's in. And the thing that we call empathy probably is inclusive of both of those things, both the sharing of the feeling and the understanding. I know some people don't include the sharing of the feeling as empathy, but whatever the case, when you empathize with somebody, I think of it as also being moved in the same way or in a similar way. And you can get moved. This is where it gets tricky when you really start to break it down. You can get moved both by sharing, like a contagion. So you're feeling what they're feeling, and if they're going through difficulty, for example. But you can also get moved in terms of your own emotional reaction to what they're going through, so that their situation becomes a stimulus for your emotional response. So that's kind of emotionally fairly complex. And I don't know if in any of the writings on the emotional part of empathy, people fully unpacked that. And then, so empathy is, fundamentally an understanding of another person's condition that has both a physiological, experiential component of a feeling with and feeling like, and also an understanding of the situation that they're in. That's how I take empathy. And when we talk about the cultivation of compassion, that empathy is a necessary step, but it's not sufficient. And because a lot of people are very capable of feeling with and understanding, yet can't move beyond that to really wish to alleviate the suffering of another. And compassion is not just the connection. It's moving out of that to try to make sure that I'm happy, you're happy, that we do what we can to kind of get out of it. You could talk about compassion doesn't necessarily have to translate all the way to the action. It can be the intention or the motivation to help and to transform that suffering or alleviate that suffering. Suffering itself is a whole other ball of wax, how you want to define that. But so when we talk about, I do think that this issue of compassion fatigue versus empathy fatigue is an interesting concept, and it's something that comes up a lot when you're working with people who are, learning to be more compassionate or training in compassion. And you talk to people who work in helping professions, social workers, healthcare workers, that this issue of compassion fatigue comes up a lot. You can call, what really is happening there is that one way of looking at what happens in those cases, and I'm sure there's a lot of different forms, but one way of looking at it is that there is just so overwhelming to deal with all this difficulty. And no matter what you do, you can't alleviate everybody's misery. So you get stuck in that. And some people call that, well, that's not really compassion, because compassion is energizing, it's limitless, and you're not stuck, you're not just hanging out on the suffering, you're trying to transform it. And there's definitely something to that. I actually think compassion is not fatiguing. And we call this compassion fatigue because it's convenient, or compassion burnout. We think of compassion, you're someone who's helping people and you can't do it anymore, so you have compassion burnout. Well, no, it's not compassion burnout. It's stuck in the hopelessness of the situation and being overwhelmed by it. That's not compassion burnout. Is that empathy burnout? Well, the resonance part of empathy can be taken to an extreme in those cases, that you're so much sharing in or struck by the condition of another that you kind of get paralyzed by that, especially when it's coming from all angles and you don't have the resources to do enough. So maybe it is more like empathy fatigue, but I like to think of it a little differently, connecting with the Buddhist notion of near enemies. And so for many of these benevolent or wholesome qualities of heart that you can develop, like loving kindness and compassion, there are what we call near enemies, things that look like compassion but aren't quite yet. So a near enemy, traditionally a near enemy for compassion is grief. So when you think about compassion as being willing to be present with the condition of the other, especially the suffering of another, and to really be moved by it, moved to the point where you want to alleviate it and transform it into something hopeful, that one of the things that can happen is you can get you can grieve and get so overwhelmingly sad and pained by their suffering that you get stuck there. So there you're stuck in the grief. I think that's a lot of what's happening with compassion, what we call compassion fatigue. There's also just the physical exhaustion element. I think it's a complex thing. And I think the reason why people have said, oh, no, it's not compassion fatigue, is empathy fatigue. I'd like to think of it as distress or grief fatigue, is that it's just trying to distinguish those situations from compassion itself, you know, and I think there's been an attempt to kind of resurrect and elevate compassion to realize it's not a draining thing, it's an invigorating thing. And I think that's true, it is an invigorating thing, because inherent in it is the wish and the motivation to transform.
Yeah. Well, this part about the definition, I think, has it does have an importance in the sense that when Barack Obama said that he was going to choose a Supreme Court justice that had empathy, it's kind of like all hell broke loose in the Senate, and there was this huge debate, and it's actually ongoing. And at one point, Jeff Sessions says, "What is empathy?" You know, it's like with this passion. I have the clip of it.
I know, it felt like a psychology conference.
Yeah, it was amazing. 500 times it was like mentioned. It's still going on. And then Phyllis Schlafly, she's the person who was.
I know her. I'm old enough to remember Phyllis Schlafly.
So she had worked, for anybody seeing this, had worked against the Equal Rights Amendment, and she's kind of been on a little bit of a campaign against empathy in the schools. And she says one of the reasons is we can't have empathy is there's no clear definition for it. So I think that and I had talked to Marco Iacoboni about this, and he said we really need to get some scholar to put all this together. It was kind of like seeing it's all part of the elephant, and it's just putting the pieces together so we see the full elephant.
But, scholars have been doing this for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, empathy is not a new area of research in psychology. And the problem is, just like anything else, there are different definitions depending on who you talk to. But I think there is some general consensus on the connection with others, the shared understanding. And how you take that to the next level of compassion, which I think is actually, empathy training is essential. And then I think you need to go beyond that. And what the compassion training does is not only, an understanding of the other, but it adds in this element of seeing the others as fundamentally the same as you. Mm-hmm. That in spite of all our differences, our different ages, our colors, our packages, our socioeconomic status, our jobs, that underneath it, we're all the same. And underneath it, we all want to be happy. We don't want to be miserable. We don't want to have pain. And we actually do a lot of exercises. There are a lot of tools in compassion cultivation, no matter what program you look at. A lot of it hinges, I think. One of the most important steps on it is that particular step. Mm-hmm. And in the compassion cultivation training program, it's step 4 of our program, and we call this embracing common humanity, which is essential that if you can't put yourself in another's shoes, which is what we might call a real extension of empathy completely, then you can't be compassionate, fully. Because really what we're talking about is being willing to put yourself out there to help others as if they were you.
Yeah.
And when you look about the kind of violence in the world and on a smaller scale level of things that's going on in schools, to help educate children not only in understanding what others going through and feeling that but also to kind of take that the next step of this could easily be me. He's really no different than I am. And if you can fully embrace that, then that really cultivates this quality, another wholesome quality of mind and standard Buddhist teachings of equanimity, which is really this impartiality. And equanimity, a lot of people think of it as kind of a state of balance, but this balance is a social balance as well. It has to do with how we relate to others. So that you're not pulled to favor certain people over others and be biased in certain ways. So you can look at it as a kind of neutrality, but it's not passive. You can also look at it as an equal likelihood of being engaged with this person and that person, no matter who.
So it's holding everyone's humanity kind of in your hands at the same time. So it's holding yourself and anyone else within the space, or maybe even beyond the space you're in, and kind of holding them in your awareness. and considering what their feelings and needs are.
And opening your heart equally.
And equally, yeah.
Yeah, and hearing. And that's the thing that is not, I think, natural to how most people are raised, in our experiences.
Yeah,
in the
we
world.
tend to put walls up against different
We naturally
group.
And and psychologically we group things, and it's a natural capacity of the mind. There are all kinds of evolved tendencies toward in-group, out-group biases. So even though some people say there's, we're inherently compassionate, we're basically good, we're inherently caring, I think there's a lot of truth to that. But there's also a long evolutionary history of us-them divisions. You look at how we evolved in groups, protecting ourselves from other groups. We learned how to recognize who was the same, who was different. So that we have to hold all those things into play and recognize that that there are challenges in doing this work. But I can also tell you that you can really see progress in dissolving these boundaries early on in the training. And there's little exercises, that you can use to do that.
Well, before we get into those, maybe we could go revisit I'd want to just lay out the definition that I've been kind of using as an operating one. I'm trying to get feedback on it, so that would be helpful. The first part is self-empathy, and that's that sense of self-awareness, mindfulness of what's going on inside of yourself. And then the second part is, I'm just calling it mirrored empathy, which is sort of through the mirror neurons. We have that mirrored quality, like if I see you now, like
that's
here.
The mimicry thing
the
we were
mimicry,
talking.
Yeah, it's called emotional empathy, or affective empathy, or resonant empathy. All that this breaks down to a lot of smaller parts, but it's basically seems to be kind of based on that mirror neuron mirroring quality. The third part is kind of an imaginative empathy, or perspective taking, cognitive empathy, which you mentioned, which kind of comes in as we have a sense of self as being separate, maybe through self-awareness, which kind of develops at 18 months or so, typically. And then the fourth part is empathic action, that as we have that resonance that with those three parts kind of bring together, that really is what creates that sense of common humanity, that we kind of really see each other and hold each other, and that our actions are kind of based on holding each other in our, I guess, in our hearts, or in our awareness. So we want to contribute to people's joy. You want to double people's joy, and reduce people's suffering, and all the emotions maybe between the two. And that what I'm kind of seeing is that compassion is really that process, the same process, like Kristen Neff talks about self-compassion, but it's the slice of that empathy kind of directed at suffering. And so it's like how we kind of relate to suffering. So both actually have an action component to them.
Yeah, I think compassion has a big action component. I mean, I think that's a very comprehensive way of thinking about empathy that you just described. I'm not so sure if I agree that compassion is the slice of that deals with suffering. I think there's overlap, like Venn diagrams, between emotion and empathy. I mean, compassion and empathy. And I don't, the slice thing sort of sounds like it's a subset of empathy. And I think there's overlap, but compassion is not a subset, in that what compassion brings in to what you're talking about is this equanimous, I don't know what the adjective would be, element of impartiality, such that we're, equally likely to share this with anybody. And I don't know if that there's something about the empathic connection that introduces that. And I don't really care unfortunately, we get caught up in the words and what they mean and what the definition is. And I think we're all trying to carve out some space and understand how it works. I think all those elements of empathy that you talked about are, man, if we could hone those skills on everybody, the world would be so much better a place, even if we didn't fully get to compassion. I mean, I feel like compassion is yet another stage of development. It feels like a level more because of this working toward this, equally willing to reach out and alleviate suffering to everybody. And that's a tall order. I mean, you can be working with it for years and not necessarily do that. I mean, I know, you're not going to, I know that my family is going to have a different response to me than strangers. But there's little pieces of progress, like in introducing humanity to people that you didn't see before, whether it's a difficult homeless person on the street or maybe a difficult non-homeless, very well-heeled person who you have to deal with. It's easy just to think, oh, he's just an arrogant SOB. I don't have to deal with him on a daily basis. Yeah, but well, guess what? At home, there's probably somebody who loves him, and he doesn't want to feel pain. And he was a baby once, and he's going to die too. And there's all these ways of humanizing these others that we tend to put in a box, whether they're economically very different, whether they, whatever. We shut ourselves down to those experiences. And when you start really deeply working with practices that try to erode that, what's amazing, it starts translating into life experience. And you start seeing, you learn, you can use your mindfulness, the awareness that you've cultivated through meditation, to see how you're pulling back. And then use that place of pulling back as a place to approach. That Pema Chodron talks about this. I think this is in her book, The Places That Scare You. But just whenever you feel yourself starting to shut down, that's where you move ahead, even though the inclination is to turn away.
Yeah.
And that's where the growth occurs the most.
Yeah, so it's really that sense of mindfulness is starting to get kind of attuned to your own bodily experiences.
Absolutely.
And notice the shifts, like, oh, I'm feeling anxious. And, why am I feeling anxious? It's not even why. It's almost like one thing I do like this freestyle dance here in Berkeley. And it's a lot of my emotional exploration. And once in the dance, I said, I feel the anxiety within myself. Instead of going off and kind of avoiding it, I want to get close to it. I want to feel the anxiety and the fear to its fullest, and I want to actually touch it, in fullest. And I would dance and move, and I could feel it kind of grow. And as I got really close to it, it kind of dissolved.
Yeah.
And then, but within 3 to 5 seconds, another anxiety, but in a whole different shape, a whole different aesthetic. It was like more of a broad heaviness kind of anxiety. And then I kind of went to that, and that dissolved. And it was like doing an hour or something of this type of stuff. And this was like one of those peak experiences. But it was just seeing how going to the fear and maybe compassion is going to the suffering, going through
the fear,
or the fear, or the loneliness, or any pain.
Fear is behind a lot of suffering. And well, my professional, academic training is in emotion, research on emotion, but I also focus on emotions a lot in meditation teaching. So in addition to the work with Stanford, I'm also on the faculty at Nyingma Institute of Tibetan Studies in Berkeley. And one of the classes I teach there is called Working with Emotions. And it's using meditative exercises to find, well, the way I look at it is developing a healthy working relationship with your emotions. And there's a lot involved in that I clearly don't have time to go into now, but what you were just talking about is something that we work with a lot, and it's rooted in really ancient meditative practices, especially in the Tibetan tradition, for going right in, instead of just, you're not just maintaining a state of, calm, and things arise and they come and you might notice them and they settle down, but rather emotion comes up and you dive into the energy.
Yeah.
Dive. Some of the Vajrayana practices really work with that. And when you're doing it, but it's a very valuable practice, and we do a version of this that's totally secularized as well. That emotions, we know from laboratory research, actually, that emotional responses are fairly brief. They build. There's, a physiological, behavioral, arousal, and experiential element that might reach a peak, and eventually it settles down. Emotions don't last very long. Most of them only last seconds. The reason they feel like they last long is because we get angry, and then we get angry again. And then what we do to try to manage the emotion feeds into it. Fear and anxiety build on each other. The more anxious you are, the more likely you are to see things as threatening. So then you have another fear response. And, when it spirals out of control, when it gets out of control, that, can be what you have like in a panic attack. But if we go back to what you were saying, if you do the practices where you try to remind yourself or relive an emotional experience that was recent, bringing yourself back not to the story of what happened, but to the feeling in the body, so that you can just create that physiology of it and allow yourself just to stay with it in the energy, and feel the feelings in your body. If you sit with it for a long time, what you'll find actually is it stops losing this particular fear nature, anger nature, and it's just, you start noticing it's just a whole set of energetic changes in the body that ultimately can be transformed in any number of ways. And what I find is if I really try to go into it for a long period of time, eventually it just evaporates and goes away. And it's a really interesting kind of practice to do. And your description of the dance really reminded me of that, because you're kind of fully occupying, in a kinesthetic sense, in a psychological sense, the energy of the emotion.
Yeah, and afterwards, after it was done, after an hour, I felt almost like bliss.
Yeah.
It was like, I kind of, having done all this reading about oxytocin, it was like every time I kind of was present with the fear, it's like my calmness went up a tiny bit, tiny bit, tiny bit. And after an hour, it was almost like a state of, of bliss. And I haven't been able to get back to that state.
But it's so valuable to be present with it, because a lot of the misery that we create around emotions is not the emotions themselves, but it's what I like to call affect about affect, or the emotions that you have about the emotion. And fear is a classic case. So that you feel the energy, the emotional physiology, if you will, of the fear, and that's associated with fear. And rather than just writing it out or just sort of being present in the moment and breathing through it and letting it run its course, we get scared that that's happening, or what does it mean that that's that? And that's how you get the spiraling up.
It was almost like as the fears came up, there were certain fears that I felt like I could feel the fear of even sharing them.
Yeah.
It was like kind of being a sense of alienation that, I wouldn't want to, address this fear to somebody else and kind of reveal that fear to someone. And it kind of reminded me of having asked, can't remember the name of the person right now, but he had said that I asked him for a metaphor of empathy, and he said it was like the archangel Gabriel going with Dante into the levels of hell together. So it was that sense of having. We've been talking a lot about the personal, right? Developing this personal empathy. And what I really liked was or really resonated, was when you said in your groups, you're actually having groups that continue on, not just doing 8 weeks, but you've got this ongoing kind of support. And so that metaphor really resonated with me, about having someone there with their arm over your shoulder, empathizing with you, going through the levels of hell together, and all the fear and suffering. So that kind of brought it around. I like to ask people about their metaphor of empathy and compassion. Usually empathy is defined as the metaphor of, standing in someone else's shoes, seeing through someone else's eyes. I see it as a cornucopia, because it kind of opens the doors to all this experience, shared experience with others. So I was just wondering what your metaphor is.
God, I haven't really, I'm sure I use metaphors. I have a metaphor. I mean, I can think about it more in terms of compassion right now. And I might not have the best one off the top of my head, because I hadn't really thought about explicit. I can tell you some of the metaphors that I use. I mean, the one that I use probably the most, or I think about the most, is really this one I referred to earlier, of expanding the boundaries of self. And you could even think of it as your own skin. Who you are gets bigger, and so big that it's inclusive of others. And that's sort of a bizarre notion in a way, not to lose one's sense of who's what you're about and what you want to do and what your goals are, but rather having a narrow protective circle, that it's ever widening in what you include as close to you. So it could be growing family, but I like the boundaries of self, the ever inclusive boundaries of self, or the growing boundaries of self, and any metaphors that call on this notion of the heart getting bigger. Also, I mean, I often talk about the Grinch Who Stole Christmas, and the old original cartoon, and about how his heart grew 10 times, that day, which very much mirrored my own experience of intensive compassion practice around my father's death. He had a slow death of lung cancer, and I was, fortunate enough to be in a place in my life where I could be by his bedside for a long time near the end, and doing a lot of compassion practice, actually specifically Tonglen, which is a taking and giving practice of sharing and willing to transform his pain and offering out healing wishes and energy. And it was a really amazing period, because what happened was, not only did it make it easier to deal with his passing and feel like I was doing something in a situation where it didn't feel like I could do anything. And in addition to massaging his feet and bringing him food and being present, it was something else to do. But it also had this amazing effect on me. I don't know if what I was doing when I was doing these practices, if he was feeling it. I don't know. I really don't know. I hope so, but I don't know. But it almost doesn't matter, because it was this amazing opportunity for connection for him and offering something up. And at the end of it, after he was gone, I just felt like my heart, this lasted for a long time, was going to literally explode out of my chest. And it's very interesting to contemplate that. I think of the heart as a metaphor for love, because it's really just an organ that pumps blood throughout the body. But where does that metaphor come from? And why do we focus on this center? There is a lot of heat there. Anyway, so the growing heart, the growing boundaries, that's mainly what I think of. I haven't really, I'd have to sit down and think about whether I could think of other ones, but that's not the one anything else I naturally come to.
Yeah, that works. I think that's
okay.
So it sounded like with your father, you were able to just be present with him and with his pain and suffering, and that it kind of, that the training for that kind of openness had just kind of grounded you, or?
Oh, no, it was much more active than that. I was doing the Tibetan practice of Tonglen. Tonglen means giving and taking. And this is what's known as an active compassion practice. And in the compassion training protocol, we don't get to this till fairly late in the 9 weeks. It's not, actually it's taught fairly traditional. There's nothing inherently Buddhist about it, but it comes from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And what you do there is you actually use imagery and breath and meditation to not only be present with the suffering of another, but to extend a hand to actually take on some of that. And you do it with breath and imagery, take on some of their suffering and use the transformative power of your heart, which is your goodwill, your willingness to help, your love, and all that stuff. Everything that is good about you, which is just brilliant and warm at the core of you, to not only eradicate that difficulty of theirs that you brought in, but then fuel your sending out a healing energetic light. So what you're doing is you're actually transforming, you're taking in their pain, their suffering, and sending out healing love and good wishes. So it's a transformative process. And what's really lovely about that practice for anybody who's working along the steps of compassion cultivation is that it's energizing and it's active. One of the things that gets frustrating when you're working with compassion and working on being present with the suffering of another is you feel like, oh God, I can't take on this burden. You can get stuck in that grief. When you have something to do with it, like this kind of thing, it's it lightens that, and it makes you feel much more active. And you're still touched by the difficulty, but you're also invigorated by this ability to help. So I think that active compassion practice element of it, so it's not just being present and being grounded, it's trying to do something to make a difference. And it's actually a difficult practice, but it's also incredibly transformative, enlightening, and invigorating.
That grounding might be kind of a prerequisite.
Absolutely.
Then you've got the energy to kind of reach out and
and you should not jump right into doing Tonglen practice without a foundation and stabilizing calm, and it's something you build up to. I should also say that I have to leave fairly soon.
Okay, yeah, we're just about
30. Oh. Yeah, and I have to pick up my son and take him to his
Okay, great. So we can bring it to a close then.
Okay.
Is there any kind of final thoughts that you have that you feel you'd like to share?
Well, I would actually like to ask you. So, is this just I didn't read a lot about what you're doing with you're collecting. I know you have a lot of interviews from a lot of people. Is this just sort of is it a starting point for something that you have in mind, or tell me a little bit about the project?
It's the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, which you see in the background here, and so it's about creating a movement for building a culture of empathy and compassion. And part of it was inspired by Barack Obama when he, ran for office. He kept saying, the country has an empathy deficit, and we need to do something about that. And that empathy was like a core value that he had, and he wanted to kind of, he felt he had the skills to kind of help heal, not heal, but bring the country together around that. So it was, partially to kind of support that effort and do what I can to contribute to that transformation. And so it's through, community organizing, through these interviews. We have over 50,000 people have kind of signed up for different, Facebook pages and, videos and networking. So this is kind of like a networking part of it, and kind of reach out to just everybody working on the topic of a theme of empathy and compassion, to kind of reach out, connect, and then start networking people together in panel discussions. And just have an online conference, and so this is part of it. So we can continue this when you have more time.
Yes. And you're in Berkeley, so
right here.
Yes, I'm right around the corner. So excellent. So I think what I would do is, my closing thoughts are to thank you for your vision in doing this and making a move to try to make some of this real. And I can say that my own work and my own practice, but in particular teaching compassion, is the most delightful thing that I do. Meditation generally, but in particular, when you're really you're in the trenches, shall we say, of working with compassion, is not. It sounds like, oh, love this, that. It's difficult work, because you're working on this ability to be present with the yucky stuff in life, the difficult stuff in life. It's not just about saying, oh, I love everybody. No, it's like, can I witness? Can I be present with the most difficult thing that's there? And instead of recoiling from it or avoiding it, can I stay? And can I open my heart to the situation and figure out what I can do to make a difference? And helping people make that transformation is just so nourishing, and it gives me a lot of hope. What also gives me hope is how many people seem to be gravitating to this training. People know they need it, and they know that there's a time for it.
So, with that wonderful ending, then, so empathy and compassion is strength, and we're going to move on.
We're going to move on. Yes.
So forcefully. So thank you so much for taking the time. So,
it's
Erika,
lovely talking.
Lovely too for me.
Okay.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.